Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today we're welcoming Mark Feldmeir to the show. Mark is the author of 5 books, including his latest work, Life After God, Finding Faith When You Can't Believe Anymore. He has served on the Adjunct Faculty at Claremont School of Theology, where he has taught homiletics and has spoken at various conferences throughout the country on topics ranging from preaching, politics, and pop culture. He currently serves as lead pastor at St. Andrew United Methodist Church in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. Mark received his BA in Religious Studies from the University of California, Riverside, 1990, and his M.Div from Claremont School of Theology, 1993. Mark enjoys cycling, skiing, fly fishing, and camping in his 2002 VW Eurovan. Let's welcome Mark to the show. Hey, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Please be joined today by Reverend, I wasn't sure how I was supposed to introduce you, so I'll give you proper introductions. Reverend Mark Feldmeir. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, Lauren. It's great to be with you today. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Glad to have you. So Mark and I are recording from our home confines. I was hoping to connect with Mark in person, but our metro area is actually getting hammered pretty good with a snowstorm. So we're recording remotely here. So I'm recording with kids and dogs at home. So hopefully we'll have a good recording here. But Mark, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate your time. And I'm looking forward to talking with you today. So you've been on the podcast before, but if you want to share just come out your background, your faith journey for listeners who are not familiar with you again.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I was raised Catholic, actually, and was Catholic up until about the age of 14, 15. And my family at the time decided to migrate into the Protestant religion. So we did a long journey of church shopping and landed in the Methodist Church eventually, where I found a real home in the Methodist youth group at that church that I was a part of for many years. And at the time found my call to ministry late in my teen years. And from there went to undergrad school and studied religious studies at UC Riverside, and then on to Claremont, where I got my M.Div. Since then, I've been pastoring a couple of churches. I did a new church plant in Southern California in Orange County, and then moved south from there and pastored a more traditional, older church for 8 years before moving to Denver in 2014, where I've been the senior pastor at St. Andrew United Methodist Church, just in the South Metro Denver area.
So you've obviously been through quite a bit here, leading a very large church, leading a church through COVID. You've experienced obviously the highs and lows of mainline church with a new church, an old established church, and now a church that's quite large in mainline standards. What has sustained you? I mean, like, especially through COVID, what have you been doing lately just to kind of sustain yourself, or what was meaningful for you during COVID, especially?
In many ways, what sustained me through COVID, in particular during the shutdown and then the reopening, was a commitment to innovation across the board. So by that I mean not just technologically speaking, which I think so many churches pivoted quickly to online platforms and online education and preaching and worship. That was a big part of what we did, but also thinking through COVID about innovation as it related to more theological orientation, and knowing that going through COVID at the time and the shutdown, hearing stories about people who just universally were leaving the church and never coming back, and in some ways, I think speaking into the questions around what it is we believe and whether what we believe is actually believable as Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And that led me to get more, I think, particular about my own theological articulation about some of the core doctrines and beliefs of classical traditional theism, if you will.
Yeah.
How we talk about God, how we think about God, and led me to, I think, just greater clarity around what it is I believe and trying to find, I guess, new and braver ways to articulate that. Uh, and that's what led to the most recent book that I published.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it sounds like that's some of what led to that. So we'll talk about that here in a second. But since I had you on, Mark, I just wanted to kind of hear some insights and learnings and kind of what's going on in your world and what you've been working on. Especially, what is it as we're recording this March 14th? So yesterday was right, the 4-year anniversary of that kind of first shutdown. I was listening to the sports radio this week, and they're talking about March 11th. If you remember, that was the day the NBA shut down 4 years ago, and just kind of thinking back, right, about those crazy memories, those wild times, and all those emotions and fears and thoughts that were going through my head, at least. So your church since COVID, I'm curious, just kind of like what's been going on in your world, and obviously in broadly speaking, in the United Methodist or the Methodist world, right? Broadly speaking, there's been a lot going on. So I'm kind of just curious, like, what are some things you've been working on, some areas of impact, and then, what's your kind of take on the divisions within the Methodist world?
Yeah, it's a big question, a good one. Locally, I think my congregation, St. Andrew, is experiencing what every local congregation is experiencing in a post-pandemic environment, which is a reallocation of resources, a realignment of staffing that's going to address the emerging needs of a post-COVID church, in particular around technology and reaching new audiences, and launching new platforms. So there's been a lot of that. There's our experience at St. Andrew has been actually, I think, pretty inspiring, and in the sense that we've been able to grow through it and adapt to new ways of doing ministry. And I think we're seeing a great deal of a positive response to that. In the process, it was, as a congregation, it forced us to be a little bit more clear about our specific values as an open, what we in the Methodist Church call a reconciling congregation. St. Andrew is the largest reconciling congregation in the denomination, and we really wanted to be able to articulate that in ways that were certainly inclusive on that issue of sexual orientation, but also to position ourselves around issues of justice and what the issues that that we were all going through during COVID with respect to race and other things. So I think we were able to lean deeper into that, be more clear with our people and with our broader audience about that. So that's been helpful. We are currently experiencing about a 70% attendance, rate versus what we were pre-COVID for in person, but our online audience, if you will, our online community is about 3 times our in-person attendance right now. So we're in the roughly 2,500 people that join us each week online, which is really exciting. And they're finding us because of our values and how those values align with what people are looking for. So that's what's happening on the local end. I think what I'm observing is that people who are active locally in the church are deeply invested in service and outreach and justice ministries. That's what's really attracting them. And an example is of one of our local schools in our area shut down last year as an elementary school, East Elementary. And it's sort of a marginalized community. We went in and partnered with the school district to rent out a significant amount of space at that church or at that school.
Mm-hmm.
And we established a marketplace where families are able to come in and shop for food to feed their families and school supplies and clothing, and all that is at no charge for families to come in.
Wow!
And we've just seen an explosion of volunteers who really fill that space, and to the extent that when they're not serving, they are they're in Spanish classes to learn how to speak Spanish, and deeply invested. So that's one of the most inspiring things I think of the last year that's happened. Drew, and I think the pandemic created that hunger to be more deeply engaged in the world. So on the denominational side, we the season, if you will, of disaffiliation. That is to say, those churches that have left the denomination over the LGBTQ question. I think denomination-wise, we lost about 7,300 churches in the country. Not many beyond that on the global scale, but so we're a denomination that's a little bit smaller. We have roughly 22,000 congregations, and I was just at a gathering 2 weeks ago in Scottsdale with 100 of the largest churches, the pastors of those churches. And I think universally there's a sense of a desire to move forward and to think about how we can be more deeply engaged in the mission of the church and not be plagued by this ongoing division that's really 50 years old. So I'm not saying it's behind us, but I think there's a great sense that there's more consensus theologically and missionally about what we're up to.
So for folks unfamiliar with the metro area, Mark's church is in Highlands Ranch, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but it's still pretty a redder community in an overall kind of blue metro area. So, and obviously by some of the things you mentioned, you're a church that might either identify or at least be identified as a church that's more on the left side theologically and maybe quote unquote politically. What are some of the ways that you've been able to engage with neighbors, community members? I imagine there's some who really appreciate what you're doing down there and some who are probably really against what you're doing. And I'm just curious, like, what thoughts do you have or what ministry endeavors have you thought about come the fall?
Yeah, to your point, St. Andrew is certainly a socially and theologically progressive congregation, and unapologetically so. And in a county, Douglas County, that is decidedly pretty red politically, and I think is dominated by a more evangelical theological orientation. So, as complicated as that sounds, it's actually the more and more we have leaned into who we are and our values and lived those out in our community, the more it's really helped us reach new people. It gives us a place to stand out from the crowd, and we, I think, clearly represent the alternative to what is the norm around us. And I think not a week goes by that I don't have somebody emailing me saying, I want to make sure before I come to your church that you really are who you are, because I've been hurt so many times. And so that's been really, I think, just personally rewarding. Last summer, our church suffered significant vandalism, and that was the graffiti that impacted us was very very much in opposition to our LGBTQ inclusion stance, and so a lot of references to scripture that about being a false prophet, and it was pretty harsh.
Yeah.
And instead of playing the victim, we decided we were going to wear that as a badge of honor and communicate to the congregation that this is what happens when you live out your vision. You get the attention of those who who are still on the journey, and we get to model what that looks like. So it's a really unusual congregation, and I'm really honored to be leading it right now.
Yeah, what are you thinking about come fall? Obviously all pastors are going to have to tackle this one way or another, and I think many mainline pastors find themselves kind of mismatched with a congregation that leans more conservative than they do. So I'm just kind of curious, like what's been your thinking and what's your advice there?
A couple of things. One, I think the preaching and teaching ministry, the church can really lean into the challenges that we're going to face as the election cycle heats up, and to really just name the tensions, name the struggles that people are going through around their kitchen tables with conversations with others that may disagree with them. I have been especially intrigued and attracted to the work of Marshall Goldberg, who late Marshall Goldberg, who has done so much work around nonviolent communication, and leading my executive team through some of his work to, I think, for us to lay the groundwork as leaders in our congregation around how to have conversations that are nonviolent, in ways that are honest and genuine and direct, candid, but are clear about what we're asking people to do when we're talking with them. So I think his work has been transformative, and certainly speaks into the times that we're in right now. So that's kind of where I'm leaning right now. As we get closer, I think I'm going to be more intuitive about what specifically we want to do in the fall, preaching wise. What I will say is the last book I wrote, House Divided, was really about political issues within a Christian conversation from a biblical perspective. I don't know that same approach for this election cycle is gonna speak into what people are feeling, because I'm not convinced that the issues are what's driving people right now in the conversations. I could be wrong, and maybe certainly immigration has been centered, abortion has been centered, but I just think the issues now are much bigger for people than single hot button issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. You can talk about AI here if you want to, but I'm just kind of curious, beyond AI, like what trends, dynamics, what's on your radar? And again, if you want to just talk about AI, we can talk about AI, but what's in ministry that you're thinking about here for the next year, next 5 years?
Yeah, I think like most churches right now, the question for us is really about how to reach people effectively. The trend for us is that we seem to be growing more quickly and more broadly beyond our region and even around the country, reaching people. And so most of our effort there has been trying to just sort of plumb the statistics about what's working and why people are finding us, how people are finding us, and trying to lead in that space that where the Christian, the gospel today still speaks into the current the current conversations that people are having outside the church. I think that's where we're headed. I mean, AI. I I'm still I'm still undecided on A, where that's going, and B, if there's even a space in place for it in church. I have a lot of colleagues who seem to be using it somewhat effectively in terms of actually just some of the most this executing on some of the simple tasks of, hey, I need to write a letter on this
Right.
congregation. So I'll do an Easter offering letter and I'll use AI to get that out. So I think there are some efficiencies there. In terms of like preaching, I'm not quite sure it offers me much because I still think it's going to produce more of what we already are hearing in a world that is sort of pushing on the edges theologically about what Christian expression, what Christian theology looks like, and so I don't know. Again, I have colleagues that have used it and seem to be pretty satisfied with it in many ways, but I'm skeptical still.
Yeah. Well, I'll say tomorrow I'm actually we're recording a special AI episode, so I can't remember if that'll air before or after this. So however you're listening to this, either look before or after. This will be right around it. And I may or may not use a voice cloned AI tool to use your introduction, to record your introduction for this episode. I am exploring it a little bit. Anything else you want to say before we move on to talking about your book? Anything else you want to give to pastors listening?
I mean, I think it's been helpful for me to talk with my colleagues about the fact that the old metrics don't work, and how do we communicate to our congregations who are used to seeing certain numbers in certain places, and to go beyond, I guess, what some would call the nickels and noses that we typically count, and that the metrics are changing. They have changed. And with that comes the expectations that have to change. And so we've been having those conversations. And I think also I have learned personally the higher value of self-care and how we pay attention to our emotional and spiritual and physical health. And just working on that personally has been pretty transformative.
Yeah. Well, thanks for engaging that with me. So we're also having Mark on here to talk about his book, Life After God, Finding Faith When You Can't Believe Anymore. A book I read a few months ago, and I was just looking through it again in preparation for this conversation, and was really struck again by some quotes. But first of all, why don't you just kind of share like what kind of inspired the book and what made you want to write it?
Yeah, it's these daily conversations that I have with folks, in particular, at least two that are most common. One is folks that are maybe in the third or even fourth season of their life. They've been Christians all their life. They've been churchgoers, and they've raised children in the church, and now their children seem to outright reject religion, Christianity, certainly church in particular. And their question is always the same, which is, how do I get them to come back? And like genuine grief over something that's so important to them as parents not being shared by their kids. And so, the book specifically, I think, addresses the question about how we think about God is very much relevant to why people may not be coming to church like they used to, or even believe like we would expect them to. And so the book addresses some of these common big doctrines, if you will, that seem to be so obstructive to and destructive actually to the Christian journey. So the big ones like omnipotence and omniscience and immutability and salvation and heaven and hell. Most of these are our classical theological orientations around those issues just are not satisfying to people anymore. They don't make sense. They're not believable. And yet they still feel this deep spiritual yearning. And they would even describe their lives as having spiritual experiences. So that's the one group. The other group is just those who come from a background of great trauma, the spiritual trauma in their lives, as a result of being a part of churches that are more rigid on some of the doctrines that we talk about in the book. So the book is really intended for those who are collectively looking for a new way of thinking about God.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess I'll go back and forth on whether or not I'm of those audiences, but I'll just say, like, I want to read just kind of a few quotes here and kind of have you respond to them, just because, like I said, just preparing for this interview, these quotes kind of struck me in a beautiful way, and I want to just share them with our audience in hopes that I guess they'll go buy the book or maybe be ministered by you. But this is a long one, but since well, I'll read the summary. You write, the very things we want to escape are the same things God wants to reclaim. And I think that's a kind of a summary there, but it's a pretty beautiful, at least to me, a pretty beautiful image. So do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, there's the number of ways I could go. I think to frame it in the context of faith relying historically on this duality that says it's either this or that. It's either heaven or hell. It's either the body or the soul. It's either flesh or spirit. It's either good or it's bad, or right or wrong, or heaven and hell. So most of our Christian conversations are framed around this dualism that says it can't be both, or there's no and in between. And that specifically relates to how we think about the world. And in that particular chapter, that quote, I think, is referencing this idea that there's a large group of Christians who think that that at some point we're going to leave this earth and be rescued from it and be raptured, if you will, into another world, and we can just leave this world behind. And so with that theology comes a sense that the things really don't matter. Matter doesn't matter, and the flesh doesn't matter, and the body doesn't matter, the earth doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, God's going to rescue us from this and redeem us. But in that chapter, I speak specifically about the vision that we find in the book of Ephesians about a new way of thinking about redemption and redemption of the world, which is not one of leaving this world behind, but God gathering all things in this world together in shalom. And so for me, the word shalom is a word that is sort of threaded throughout the book. Shalom, we often think it signifies like the absence of war or conflict.
Mm-hmm.
We think of it as maybe as peace, but the Hebrew understanding of shalom is far more radical, and it suggests that the coming together of opposites. And so these things that we think are irreconcilable, the vision that we find in the Bible around shalom is that God wants to bring them together in unity. So if you look at, for example, the prophet Isaiah, who speaks of the peaceable kingdom, and that vision in the book of Isaiah of the child playing over the hole of the asp and the lion laying down with the lamb, and all these images of in our minds would be completely irreconcilable. This would never happen. But this is the vision of the kingdom of Shalom, or the peaceful kingdom. So what does that look like in the real world? It looks like the earth matters just as much as heaven matters, and body and spirit and flesh and soul. And how do we bring these together in a more unitive vision?
Yeah. I want to read the whole quote, but I don't think I can get it out. So check out the book, page 180. I think that's found on. Another quote here again that really, really resonated with me. You write that meaning, purpose, beauty, mystery, novelty, these are often the lamentable casualties of life in the modern world. And I'll frame it this way. I've been really reading quite a lot of Andrew Root. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. But he writes that one of the casualties similarly, of our modern context is that, we live in a context, especially societally, where it's like we're encouraged to have deep experiences, but then like our modern society says that there's nothing to those, there's nothing more than those experiences. So that we are living in this modern world where these things we don't know what to do with. So share more about that quote, if you would.
Well, what the modern world wants to do ever since Enlightenment is to reduce everything to matter, and from matter into atoms, and the message is that everything is mechanistic and everything is in that way deterministic. One thing impacts the other, and it's inevitable. And so we flatten a multidimensional world into a one dimension that is mostly about atoms and matter. And the message is that there's nothing beyond what we see and what we touch and what we can feel and taste and hear. When we know more modern physics, quantum physics suggests that there are dimensions of time and space that are well beyond our capacity to understand or comprehend. So along the way, what happens is we surrender our experiences and even our appetite for transcendence, and everything that's important is in the now, and it's what we can see. And so I think what I'm seeing as a pastor is this deeper longing for transcendent experiences of the sacred in the ordinary world. And one example that I think applies to that is for the last 2 years, and I'll be doing it again this year, leading a group of people from my church to walk the Camino in Spain.
Yeah.
And the first time I did this, I took a dozen young adults from my church, and we walked a portion of the Camino. And this idea that that adventure and novelty and beauty and transcendence can happen on a simple pilgrimage through Spain, and to walk into cathedrals that are 500, 700, 800 old, and to get a sense of that beauty and wonder that transcends our own understandings of space and time. It was a transformative experience, and I think we need to be doing more of that in the church.
I love it. I love it. Last quote here, and this is one that I think, me personally, I despise the most, and also speaks to me. I despise the most, but also speaks to me the most. You're right. Even what seems like wrong turns can always lead to the right place. And to me, I think that's just like the beauty of, I don't know, where do we want to use the gospel, the love of Jesus? Let's talk more about that.
Well, I think it speaks to the conversation we just had about the reductivism and determinism of the modern world, which we apply to God, and we assume that there is only one right way and one wrong way.
Yeah.
And that if we do X, then inevitably Y will happen, right? And so it reduces the spiritual journey to a right path or a wrong path versus when you read Scripture, how many times over and over again do you see expressions and experiences of people who make one bad or maybe one wrong turn, but still end up in the same place? And that's what the gospel is about. And I think we know this intuitively, whether we are Christians or not. There is always another opportunity, moment by moment, to choose differently. And in each moment, there are new possibilities, some of which are good and some of which are bad, and most of which are somewhere on the spectrum of best for us and not so good for us. And every step of the way, we get to choose which next possibility will make real in our lives, and then that opens up new possibilities from there. So, this is at the heart of sort of a process theology, open and relational perspective. There's never ever one move that we can make that will separate us from the love of God. How's that? Nothing in life or in death.
Yeah. I think that's the most, to me, that right there is the most compelling aspect, I think, of process theology, at least for me. As much as I can go back and forth on, those bigger topics, right? It's this, the beautiful idea that like, there's no like wrong turn and you're out of it. So, grateful for your work. I'm thinking, I don't know if you're familiar, Heather Thompson Day has written, she had a book, she talked about that. I'm thankful for that aspect and appreciate you sharing it in the book. So the book is, again, Life After God, Finding Faith When You Can't Believe Anymore. Mark Feldmeir, should be available, right, wherever books are sold. Yeah. We're also, I also need to give you a plug here for the conferences coming up at your church here in April.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit about those?
Yeah, we've got a couple of conferences planned that we're working on with Tripp Fuller from Homebrewed Christianity and Tom Ord, who is doing some wonderful work in spaces around deconstruction and open and relational theology, a good friend of mine. So we're hosting two conferences. The first is just a conference specifically for pastors and preachers who want to explore new ways of thinking and preaching from an open and relational or process theology orientation, and understanding that the mode and the forms of preaching that are informed by process or open and relational theology are in many ways distinctive from forms that we might inherit from a classical theological orientation. So that is called Persuade, and that's a conference in April, and that'll be followed immediately by a 2-day conference that will be primarily led by Tripp Fuller and Tom Ord, called God After Deconstruction. And they've done one event in New Jersey. They'll be doing another one here in Denver, and we're going to host that at St. Andrew. So would love to have folks join us for that.
Awesome. So I should be there. I'm fortunate to be able to attend those. So I'll look forward to connecting with you then in person, Mark, and then others who can attend. So let's just roll into these final questions, because like I said, I'm home with kids and running out of quietness, capacities. So you've answered these before, Mark. So if you want to take these, you're welcome to pass if you'd like. But anything you feel differently about maybe being Pope for day? Any new thoughts there?
Yeah, I think, Lauren, since my last visit with you on the podcast, I certainly two major events are happening in our world right now. One in Gaza and one in Ukraine. And if I were Pope for a day, I probably would leverage whatever authority I have to bring a ceasefire in Gaza and to condemn the acts of violence and war on Ukrainians and by the Russian government. And I think in some ways the current Pope has done that, especially on the Gaza side. I think more recently his comments about Ukraine waving the white flag, a little trouble.
Yeah.
So I would probably, and not to mention, let's just get it done in terms of ordination of women and allowing people to marry and all those other issues. So those are big, but
it's a full day there, but an important day. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Yeah. Somebody that has influenced me a great deal personally, David Rick Griffin, who was a process theologian who died about a year and a half ago. And David had a particularly strong influence on me in helping me see new ways of thinking about God. And while certainly I studied under him, to have him back in the world and to have conversations specifically about one of his last books was called James and Whitehead on the Afterlife. And David Ray Griffin sort of suggested in some way controversially that he believed in life after death, and gave maybe this is a book on his justification for why and how he could believe that. So it'd be great to have him come back and just check out to see if he was if he was right.
Yeah, he's got some data there. What do you think history will remember from our time and place?
Yeah. I love that question because you can either go super cynical on it or super hopeful.
Yeah.
And I'm inclined sometimes to go cynical. So let me say this, that maybe someday people will look back and say they finally figured out that that they could do something about climate change and the global issues that we're facing, and that they acted in time. How's that? And actually finally came around and changed their ways. I would hope.
Yeah. Any more hopes then for the future of Christianity?
Well, I think to be I think to be mindful of the fact that there's going to be a great deal more deconstruction that has to take place. I'm hopeful about that, actually. And I'm hopeful that with the deconstruction comes reconstruction. That was part of the whole purpose of my book was to address why we need to deconstruct some of these doctrines and how we could reframe them in ways that are more meaningful and vulnerable. So that's my hope for the future of Christianity.
Yeah, and if I can editorialize there, I think that's one thing that I appreciate about your work here is like you're not just taking a sledgehammer to things. You're looking to give people something to build off of again. And that, as someone who's clearly invested in this whole thing, that's what I think is most important. So I appreciate that. All right, any you want to share where folks can connect with you?
Yeah, most direct way is my website, markfeldmeir.com. Certainly, I'm on social media as well, and people can also find me and see me kind of in action at gostandrew.com, which is the website for St. Andrew United Methodist Church. Lots of stuff there that people can poke around with.
All right, well, stay safe and stay warm here as I'm looking out my window. Snow keeps coming down. Always leave folks with the word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
And with you, friend. It's good to be with you again, Lauren. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.